now that we've addressed the history aspect of film, its production, its post-production, it's finally your turn to be in the spotlight. Because after all, films are made for an audience to see, and in this case, the audience is you. In this week's Crash Course, we will talk about how fandoms are created, how fans receive and interpret content, and how really the producer and the fan aren't all too different. Welcome to this week's Crash Course. Films are made for the masses, and despite Netflix and the availability of online streaming, the best way to view a film is still in the audience, at least in my opinion. So if it's made for the masses, let me just define what mass culture means. So mass culture is a set of ideas and values that develop from a common exposure to the same media and news sources, music and art. Mass culture is broadcast or otherwise distributed to individuals instead of arising from their day-to-day interactions with each other. So, mass culture is not exactly popular culture, although often the case is that things that are addressed to masses do in fact become popular. However, popular culture could be either folk culture, which is popular culture made by the people, or popular culture made by a dominant group, which is in this case mass culture. And when we're talking about such popular culture made by the dominant group, we're talking about hegemony. We're talking about hegemony. That's a difficult word. Hegemony is the leadership or dominance, especially by one's country or social group over another. So when we go to watch a movie in the cinema, often what's on the screen, we get the impression that we don't really have a say in what is displayed. But that's where I'm gonna prove you wrong today. We've already addressed historical aspects in the first few episodes of this crash course, but for this one I need to take you a bit back in time. Back in the 1920s, the Frankfurt School was established, and two of the main critics from the Frankfurt School were Adorno and Horkheimer. Now, who are Adorno and Horkheimer, you may ask? Adorno and Horkheimer are the main theorists of the Frankfurt School, and they're known for their critical theory, as they critique modernity and a capitalist society. Instead, they have a Marxist philosophy, and their focus is on commodification, reification, fetishization, and the critique of mass culture. They believe that culture is handed down to us, and culture has a mass deceptive aspect to it, which is used to control the masses. Thank you for that. So now that we know who Adorno and Horkheimer are, we need to talk about what they believed in. Adorno and Horkheimer believed or took an approach that was called a top-down model approach, and they believed that culture was handed down to us. And since the audience that the work is targeting is a mass audience, they believed that these works had the ability to mass deceive the audience. They therefore saw the audience as a sort of passive prey, let's just say, as in just an audience sitting back in a chair watching what events are unfolding on the screen in front of them, and really didn't have much say in what was happening. While Adorno and Horkheimer were two theorists of the Frankfurt School, Stuart Hall was a theorist of the Birmingham School. Stuart Hall is a main theorist of the Birmingham School. He coined the term cultural studies and analyzed popular culture and the masses. And while Hall did not particularly disagree with the Frankfurt School, in fact he was even influenced by Marxist himself, he did not perceive a culture from a top-down model, but instead saw it as a circuit, as industry impacting the audience and the audience impacting the industry. So while the Frankfurt School had a more singular perspective in that they focused on mass culture itself, the Birmingham School focused on both mass culture as well as its surrounding subcultures. Culture was like a circuit in that its impact lay both in the encoding as well as the decoding phases. So while consumers and producers are still considered very distinct, they did impact each other. Let's rewind to the word I mentioned earlier, hegemony. Remember its definition, the ideology imposed by those in power. When we're talking about hegemony, we're actually talking about what Althusser calls the ideological state apparatus. Another difficult word. Althusser states that institutions such as education, the churches, family, media, trade unions, and law, which were formerly outside state control but which served to transmit the values of the state, to interpolate those individuals affected by them, and to maintain order in society, above all to reproduce capitalist relations of production. While the Frankfurt School saw the ISAs as creating a sort of false consciousness in which the audience is passive, the Birmingham School and Stuart Hall in particularly had an issue with this, as they didn't see content as purely manipulative, nor did they see audiences as purely passive. Instead of what Hall referred it to as was a terrain of struggle, or what he said was the people against the power block. Now, a lot of things have changed since the Birmingham School and the Frankfurt School, and what we now have is something called a reception theory. Now, a man named John Fiske, who was born in 1939, a media scholar who studied at Cambridge University, coined the term semiotic democracy, which implies the delegation of the production of meanings and pleasures to television's viewers. While the Frankfurt School focused on how the industry impacted audiences, and the Birmingham School took it a notch further and studied how the industry impacted audiences and audiences interpreted content, theorists like John Fiske saw the potential of fans and therefore studied how fans not only interpreted but created content additional to what was already there. So let's give you a couple more definitions. A fan is a person who has a strong interest in or admiration for a particular sport, art form, or a famous person. And a fandom, thus, is the fans of a particular person, team, fictional series, and so forth, regarded collectively as a community and subculture. Let's take an example of one of these fandoms, and that's the fandom of the Whedonverse. Now, you may ask, what is a Whedonverse? Whedonverse is the term Whedon and universe sutured together. Joss Whedon is an American screenwriter, producer, and director, and is creator of shows such as Buffy, Angel, and Fireflies, and films such as The Avengers, Toy Story, and Serenity. Joss Whedon is loved amongst the geekdom, and he himself is known as a fanboy himself. I also heard he is the subject of study in a class taught by @VirtualCasey called A Filmmaker. #English481. Now let me explain why geekdom really isn't such a bad word, because honestly, being a fan isn't per se a bad thing. Increasingly so, actually, being a fan is often embraced, especially when you're within a fandom, because a fandom, like I said earlier, is like a collective society. For example, the fans of Firefly named themselves the Browncoats after the Browncoat Rebels in the Firefly series. And fun fact, Serenity would likely not have existed if it weren't for the Browncoats, as the Browncoats, the fandom of Firefly, took it upon themselves to protest about Firefly getting pulled from Fox. So now that we're on the topic of Whedon, let's talk about Buffy. I'm sure most of you have seen some of Buffy. If you haven't, I highly suggest binging it, although not before exams. For those who have, remember that character Robin Wood in season 7? Remember the principal? Ring any bells? Well, actually, Whedon named this character after someone who he looked up to, Robin Wood. Now, who is Robin Wood, Frank? Robin Wood was born in 1931. He wrote reviews on famous filmmakers such as Hitchcock, Bergman, Penn, but also taught at universities and published a magazine called Cine Action. What an ambitious man. Wood argued that so many things feed into art which are beyond the artist's conscious control, not only his personal unconscious, but the cultural assumptions of his society. Now, in an interview with Louisa Stein, who is a fan studies researcher who focuses on millennials, Louisa Stein argues that millennials are socially minded millennials, which means that rather than sitting back and watching what unfolds on the screen in front of them, as the outdated ideology of the Frankfurt School suggests, fans take their self-representation in own hands and turn to places like the internet if they want to transcend those boundaries set by the industry. To add on to this, she argues that in feels culture, emotion remains intimate but are no longer necessarily private. Rather, they build a sense of an intimate collective on that is bound together precisely by the processes of shared emotional authorship. Now, in his book Speculative Blackness, Carrington argues in his chapter Dreaming Color that he wishes for an acclimatization and normalization of colored characters in any work. He therefore created the blog called Remember Us, in which fans can take it upon themselves to create any content such as artworks, fan fiction, poems, and basically fill in the voids in which they have felt misrepresented in before. Now, there are different ways in which these voids can be filled. For example, in The Chosen One, a fan fiction created by Fire, she rewrites a particular scene of Buffy, but identifies Kendra with a commonality rather than a difference. So by portraying Kendra as a young, carefree child on an island home, she adapts her narrative to her own standards. In contrast to that, another fanfiction called Little Blue Bottles, an alternative take on Buffy is offered. So the author actually builds up on Kendra even after her death, and by doing so, the author is able to allow Kendra to transgress boundaries otherwise set for her in the original series. Fans are able to build upon existing content, create new content, make content more relatable, and even push the industry into the direction that they please. And this is all due to the rise of the internet and the digital turn. Places like forums, blogs, discussion panels is what allows for the fan base to create such an intimate collective, and this proves that fan engagement is just as important as the production of a work. This is it for this week's Crash Course. I hope you enjoyed, and I'm gonna go watch Buffy now.
Crash Course Film Production is produced in association with PBS Digital Studios. You can head over to their channel to check out a playlist of their latest shows, like Space Time, It's Okay to Be Smart, and Physics Girl. This episode of Crash Course was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio, with the help of these nice people. And our amazing graphics team is Thought Cafe.